Speakers today, and they are sitting here. This is Matt Botvinick, Naomi Feldman, Konrad Koerding, and Raj Rao. You see a little bit their interests again repeated from the slides, which are also the intro slides which we saw yesterday. Now, our goal, what do we try to do? I think we are more computational people, and I have a whole bunch of potential panel topics in case nobody knows what to ask and what to do in the end. But I think we come a little bit more from a high-level computational approach. And if you like the David Marr approach of algorithms and theory and implementations, I would assume we are a little bit more on the algorithms and theory side rather than on the implementation side. And the question is then, of course, how do you connect with these ideas to the low-level brain? And there's a whole bunch of questions which you may ask, and this is about computational models, how much they are actually useful, how abstract they should be the super low level, like compartmental models of neurons, and from that you figure out how cognition works, or should you start some higher level and then try to break it down and figure out from some algorithmic view what is actually a systems theory of what the brain is doing, which you might be able or may not be able to break down at some point to the neural level. There's also questions which, the deep learning world has shaken up the world a little bit in terms of how you compute and how you should think about scientific discovery. And there's clearly a question that maybe all this modeling stuff is completely useless and we should just do empirical inference bottom up and try to compute with massive databases somehow the structure out of the system, or maybe we don't even need to understand the structure that much, but just figure out how to relate it to behavior, function, cognition, if this is possible at all in this way. So these are some questions which we just formulated as backup questions. Obviously, the audience should kind of guide the questions, and you should ask whatever you'd like. And the panel will basically insert their own topics. And with that, I think I just directly go over to Matt, who will take over with the first part of presentations. And he gets the dongle.
Let's see what happens this time. Flip. Okay, great. So thank you for inviting me. I'm really excited to hear the conversation that will ensue from this, and I've enjoyed the conversation so far. In the spirit of fostering discussion, I'm going to speed through some completed work and try to end on a note where I'm reaching out for help from the computing community, because we're trying to undertake some things in our lab, and we're not quite sure how to go about them. We know the kind of thing we want to do, but we're looking for tools, so you'll see it's open-ended. But in general, we're interested in discovering structure and behavior. So we can start with a point of contact between computer science and neuroscience that's been extremely important over the past 15 years or so, and that's the link between neuroscientific studies of reward-based decision-making and learning and computational reinforcement learning. So many of you be familiar with the dopamine story, where a link has been established between phasic firing in dopaminergic neurons over time and what you would expect from a reinforcement learning prediction error signal. We see this at the single unit level. We see it in fMRI data, and we see it in a variety of different brain structures. There's also, in addition to a huge body of work now unpacking that connection, there's been increasing interest in another basis for action selection that also is computationally explicit, which has to do with building internal models of the way the world works and one's own reward function, and then making decisions in a planful way based on those internal representations. So people like Nathaniel Daw have been very influential here in the neuroscience community, training human subjects on transition patterns and then looking at what happens in their brain as they navigate through these little toy worlds. So we've learned a lot, and there's been a general air of celebration in neuroscience around the successes that have come out of this work. One thing that has struck me, and I try to impress this on my neuroscience grad students, is that if you look instead at the computer science literature on trying to scale reinforcement learning algorithms up to large problems, you get a different sort of feeling. It's not a victory lap at all. There are severe problems in trying to get these basic algorithms, at least, to apply to large-scale problems. And the way that I always explain it to neuroscientists is, you have the curse of dimensionality. If you're trying to search for this reward in a decision tree, as the decision tree gets bigger, unless you have some way of effectively shrinking it, you're never going to learn what you need to learn. And what we've been interested in as neuroscientists and cognitive scientists is how the brain deals with this problem, how human beings deal with this problem. And as is our wont, we've reached into computer science for potential answers. And so we've become very interested in hierarchical reinforcement learning, which is just like ordinary reinforcement learning, except it includes subtasks or subroutines or macros so that you can sort of leap through decision trees and effectively shrink their size. So without going into details, because I want to get to other stuff, I'll just indicate to you that we've done a number of studies testing, and I think to some extent validating the idea that the brain implements an algorithm that has something in common with computational hierarchical reinforcement learning. So you get prediction error signals at multiple levels of task structure. If you ask somebody to play a game where they go into a casino and then they play a number of slot machines, you'll get prediction errors at both the slot machine level and at the casino level. If you have them play a little video game where they have to navigate to a sub-goal, a little package, and then they have to navigate from there to a goal, a house where they're delivering the package, you see prediction error signals that are related to the sub-goal as well as to the goal. And these are new discoveries that were directly, the experiments were directly inspired by computational algorithms. Another question that we've asked, again inspired by the hierarchical reinforcement learning literature, is how are the subtasks identified? How do they emerge? Because in order to use them, you have to have a kind of toolbox of subroutines or macros. And we've done a number of studies, and this is our most recent work, looking at how this kind of task decomposition emerges in the brain. And to do this, we've used multivariate techniques, similarity-based techniques that are related to the ones that Jim Haxby talked about and Odolova talked about. So we expose people to a time series of stimuli that's generated based on a random walk through this graph that has obvious community structure, right? Clusters. And if you do, say, a spectral embedding, you find similarity structure in this graph that looks like this. So the nodes that live together in a community end up being represented similarly. You can use a number of different embedding techniques that generate the same outcome. And we find this same pattern in the brain, in the left inferior frontal cortex. So again, just to give you a flavor of the sorts of things that we've been doing, we find the same thing in an instrumental task where people actually have to make actions in a structured domain. This is the Tower of Hanoi. Again, we find the inferior frontal cortex breaking that domain up into sub-regions that can then be used to plan hierarchically. Okay, so that's, we've been inspired by computer science and we've gotten this far, but as I've been doing this work, I've become interested in a deep problem that's associated with leveraging these advantages of hierarchical processing. And it has to do with the challenge of finding good abstractions. It's not enough to just have hierarchy. You have to have a good hierarchy. And this is a simple demonstration of that. If you have an agent navigating through this little grid world, and it has to get from this green point to this red point, if you give it sub-goals that are at the blue points there, it'll do much better, and this is the blue learning curve here, than if you give it just simple low-level actions. So that makes it look like hierarchy is a good thing, it's a win. But if you give it bad sub-goals, the corners of these rooms, it actually takes longer to solve the task. So the question is, what is a good representation? What's a good set of, what's a good task decomposition? And we've done some work quite recently, just published, attacking this question in a purely formal, theoretical way in graph worlds, looking at all the different ways you can decompose a graph world and using Bayesian model comparison to decide what's the best way of decomposing this world if you're then going to hand the decomposition to a hierarchical agent that's going to use it to plan. And one insight that's come out of this, it's the sort of thing that I fear might have been obvious to a machine learning person, but it's a thunderbolt to a neuroscientist, is that as you move up the pecking order in terms of this model comparison measure, the agent who's handed this task decomposition can represent its own optimal behaviors in a more and more compact way, fewer bits, and it also does better when you hand it new tasks from the same world. All right. So what I take, again, apologies for giving you just a high-level gloss on all of this work, but the point that I take away from this work that we've been doing is that adaptive behavior depends on compact representations, and those compact representations depend on the structure of the problems that the agent is facing. And so this is the way I think about hierarchy now. It's a way of doing data compression on the set of behaviors the agent needs to develop. So the problem that I now face is that taking this perspective, hierarchy just seems like one of many, many different kinds of compression the agent could do. And I'm trying to kind of take off the blinkers, which have kept me focusing on hierarchy for all this time, and think about other kinds of structure that the brain might capitalize on in order to come up with compact representations. I'm going to skip these 2 slides in the interest of time. So in doing this, I want to look at naturalistic behavior. That's where the statistics are. Of course, this has been a very successful enterprise that continues to unfold, as we've already seen in the world of vision, looking at naturalistic images, trying to discover what their statistical structure is, and then leveraging the insights that come from that to understand how the brain is coding them. What's starting to happen now is that people are applying the same logic to behavior. Just starting, really, I think. So Josh Shavitz at Princeton is doing this with fruit flies, just looking at their unconstrained behavior, using machine learning techniques to map it out. And that's what we're trying to do. So this is where I need help. We've got, the technology allows us now to put our lab manager in his kitchen, untethered, and cook. He can cook dinner. We can record this for 4 hours. He's got a head cam. We can monitor his movements. We can monitor his position in the room. And what I'd like to do is attack this kind of data the way that people attack natural images and try to discover the statistics that the brain might capitalize on in order to come up with compact representations. The problem I face is this, and this is what I'll close on. What I want to get away from is going in with an a priori hypothesis about what the structure is. I mean, so far I've been going into behavior saying, it's hierarchical, where's the hierarchy, right? And most of the data mining techniques that I've looked at so far continue to bring that on board. So looking at, for example, hierarchical Dirichlet process, HMMs, for those of you familiar with them, they assume that behavior is decomposable into these kind of discrete segments. Maybe it's not. Slow feature analysis, some of you be familiar with that. It also imports these a priori assumptions. On the other end of the spectrum, deep learning seems to import fewer a priori assumptions, but then you end up with something that is quite difficult to boil down into basic principles. So this is what we're chewing on, and I'm looking forward to discussing it with people, and I'll stop there. Thanks.
Okay, hi. So I've been really enjoying hearing all about the brain. In contrast to, as far as I can tell, basically everyone here, I've actually never worked with brain data. And so what I'll be talking about is how we can combine computing and cognitive science to study the mind. And specifically, the kinds of questions that I'm interested in are questions about higher level things than we've been hearing a lot about, so things about language in particular, and speech in more particular, so how learners acquire speech sound categories, how they perceive speech in noisy situations, and how they represent the speech that they hear. And so these have words like categories and representations that aren't necessarily directly measurable from the brain, but are critical to studying the mind. And there's been already quite a bit of progress in cognitive modeling in combining techniques from the brain, from the mind, so from experimental tasks and from computational methods. And so a common approach is to bring people into the lab and then measure things that come out of their brain. So things like behavioral data or neural data, and then build some sort of a cognitive model to try and predict those data. And so what I'm going to try and argue is that actually there are some problems with this approach in terms of doing what we are aiming to do here. First of all, this cognitive model, so it draws on techniques from computation, but it's usually actually done by cognitive scientists. There are a few computer scientists who are really interested in building models to understand human data, but mainstream, especially in my field, which is language and computational linguistics, researchers aren't that interested in building cognitive models, and if so, it's a side project. And so we're leaving the computer scientist out of the loop here. We're just taking the techniques. And the second kind of thing that many of you who study vision will be very familiar with is that actually measuring what comes out of the brain or the mind is not all we want to do. In fact, there's a lot of evidence that systems are trained to fit their environment, and these are some buzzwords that come from different fields that all in some way express that idea. And so to understand the mind, we really need to study the environment. And so I think this is a lot further along in vision than it is for example, speech and cognitive modeling of speech. And so I would actually categorize cognitive modeling and also behavioral and neural data as being cognitive and brain science techniques. And so from computing and engineering, actually what people in that field seem to be really good at and have worked on for decades is characterizing the environment. That is, there are corpora of speech, there are corpora of language, there are collections of information from the whole world, and there's been years of research on engineering features that can work well with that information that's in the world. And so if we want to understand what the mind is doing for specific cognitive tasks and in a situation, in a specific environment, then that's a place where computer scientists and cognitive scientists can each work on questions that are really of interest to them, and we can build productive collaborations. My colleague Jimmy Lin actually called this big data for cognitive science the other day. I like that. Okay, so I'm going to show you, we're just getting started on this. I come from the tradition of just trying to predict the output data in the lab. But recently, I've been collaborating with Aaron Jensen, who's an engineer who works on low-resource, zero-resource speech recognition, and Caitlin's a research assistant in my lab. And we've been asking the question of how speech is represented in the mind. And so speech, you can represent it a lot of ways. It's a dynamic signal. It's changing continuously. It contains information in both frequency and time. And what we've been trying to do is to apply this collaborative approach where we draw on both traditions to study these representations. So this is an example of something that gets tuned to fit the environment. Speech perception changes over the first year of life. So we can see that infants' perception of non-native sounds changes between 6 and 12 months. It gets tuned to fit their native language. And the same thing for vowels as well as consonants. And this is actually important. So we know that people can generalize better than speech recognition machines, especially to new talkers, new dialects, new accents. And also, listeners who have been exposed to a language are much better at perceiving that language than listeners who have not been exposed to the language. And so this representation seems to matter, and it seems to sort of contain information about the environment. And so we've been using speech corpora and methods for representing the speech signal that come from automatic speech recognition, and testing them against cognitive data using a cognitive model to try and get some insight into how speech is represented, and to see whether this kind of collaboration can be productive in letting us address questions about speech representations. Okay, so essentially what we've been using is a cognitive model that was validated against laboratory data in many different situations, but has never been before trained on a distribution of speech sounds from the input. And so essentially this model is trying to predict whether a listener will say that two sounds are the same or different. And the hypothesis is that listeners' perception is just biased toward the sounds that they expect to hear. And so if a sound is high probability in their language, then they'll be biased toward that kind of sound. And we can formalize that using a model. And then since different speech representations give you different distributions of sounds in the input, we can actually train a model with this kind of speech representation, and then the same model with the second kind of speech representation, and have them both predict listeners' data. And so in doing that, then we get a measure of how well those speech representations are accounting for how people perceive speech. So this is ongoing work, and we've just started. So far we've looked at speaker normalization, so looking at whether techniques from automatic speech recognition that are used to normalize across speakers can get you a better match to human data. And so on this graph, this is the log likelihood of the model given the human data that we collected in the lab. And then these are just the different numbers of dimensions that we're allowing the model to use. So the one-dimensional model is very impoverished in terms of the representation it's using. But across a wide range of dimensionalities, we see clear and consistent results that the speaker normalization is something that listeners seem to be using. At least they seem to be encoding that kind of information in some way when they're perceiving sounds in the lab. And so what this means is that this kind of collaboration can give a productive way to measure things that are otherwise tough to measure in the mind. And this is a central role for the mind, so I actually haven't touched brain data yet. So just to finish up, I want to start to think about where this is leading in the multiple different fields. So if this is a true collaboration, then we'd like it to lead to interesting questions across multiple fields. I think that's pretty clear for cognitive science. So we now have a way to evaluate hypotheses about cognitive representations of speech. We can make whatever hypotheses we want. We can train it on whatever corpora we want. And we can predict whatever data we want from the lab as long as we have a model of those data. Having looked at some of the engineering tools that have been developed and the features that have been developed in speech technologies, some of them are really promising. So the one that we looked at so far was normalizing across speakers. But for example, for the vision people, there's a, you guys presumably have heard about edge detectors. There's a speech feature that's sort of analogous. It's called Rasta. I see it as essentially an edge detector for speech. And I think that's really interesting from a cognitive perspective, even though I've never learned about it in a speech perception class or a language class. A benefit to engineering, so speech representations that yield good performance in speech recognition, such as the ones that normalize across speakers, seem to also be good at predicting human data from the lab. And that suggests that there are some parallels in what people are doing and what engineers have developed in order to deal with speech data. And so that's promising for looking forward. Obviously, we haven't yet improved speech technologies, but it's promising that we can, that these measurements are parallel across the two fields. And finally, again, I've never looked at brain data. I'm very interested in it. We have existing data on neural activity when listening to speech. And there are various different types of data. And so I don't necessarily think that we know how to map between the neural activity and the kinds of representations that or the computations that one might do on a speech signal in order to get it to generalize in the way that people do. But given that we have a way of testing this at the cognitive level and we have a way of measuring it at the neural level, I think there are promising questions that we can ask to integrate those two fields. Thanks.
So today I'll be talking about uncertainty and its representation, and it's a great pleasure for me to be here on the panel today. My interests in cognitive science and neuroscience and in computation. On most days I can only wear one of those three hats. And it's just delightful to be able to combine all of them. I should also say I will be talking not really about the data coming from the lab, but about some ideas that I've recently been very excited about. And before I talk about all those things, I want to talk about why am I interested in uncertainty? Well, from the perspective that with which I approach it, and many people in a broad field in computational neuroscience and neuroscience as well, we view uncertainty as the big problem that the brain ultimately has to solve. And that's why I'm studying it. And I should first highlight what the approach is that we generally take. So what we do when we build the models that we built in that field, and I should say that I'm talking about normative models in cognitive science mostly here. What we do is we measure the world. We go out there and we measure brightness distributions or word distributions. It's exactly the same thing. We go out there and we measure the properties that the brain has to concern itself with. We also measure the uncertainty. We can do a psychophysical experiment where we can measure how uncertain a given input is, how uncertain, say, vision is, how uncertain our sense of movement is. And then what we do is we take a model that incorporates these the characteristics of the problem that the brain has to solve, and we derive how the optimal solution to that looks like. And then we compare the optimal solution with the actual behavior. And that field has been remarkably successful with multiple books that have been written on that general approach. And I just want to show one example. So this is the area in which much of my research from my PhD until about now was, and I should at least show one example of that. So what we did is we wanted to understand saccadic adaptation. So saccadic adaptation paradigms are, you take a monkey, and whenever the monkey looks from here to over there, we cheat while the eye is in flight. So instead of the eye is in flight from here to there, but instead we remove the target and we move it a little further to the right. What will the monkey do? Well, over time the monkey makes larger and larger saccades in that direction, or smaller if we do a paradigm like that. Now this is data from Rick Robinson's lab. You see that in shaded gray there. And what he did is he had the monkey do that for 1 hour, and then the monkey goes into a dark room where the monkey sees absolutely nothing for a whole night. And then during the night, you can see it's shooting back up. It's kind of going back to normal. And then it again happens over the course of the day, of the 1 hour of training, that it goes down, it shoots up again, goes down, shoots up and again, and so on and so forth. And now there were several models, and I don't want to go into any detail about it there, that had been explaining similar data. But what we did differently is we measured exactly how the oculomotor system of a monkey was normally changing. So we take a monkey that doesn't adapt, and we measure how it fluctuates over time, how the hours fluctuate over time that monkey does. We fit it to that, we fit the model, and that gives us the red curve that we have here. And you see, the main thing to take away from here is that the model based on uncertainty, as measured in the real world, does a very good job at predicting behavior for that monkey, and there's many analogous experiments where that was done. Now, the upshot of that field is that humans and other animals seem to be pretty good at dealing with uncertainty in their everyday life. But the question is now what the next step is. What can we take from there? And there's multiple ways how we can interpret that. But one of the ways of interpreting about it is that the brain has basically been built around the idea that it needs to deal with uncertainty. If you want, we are born statisticians. And people came up with a good number of theories of how the brain could be representing uncertainty. If uncertainty is so central, there should be simple code for uncertainty. For example, one of the models said if we have more uncertainty, we should have fewer spikes. Because fewer spikes in a Poisson model means that we get less information, which we can say implies that there's more uncertainty. But other people said more uncertainty should lead to broader tuning of neurons. Or more uncertainty should lead to earlier or later spikes, or more uncertainty should lead to more variability. So we designed a task, and this is collaborative work with my collaborator Lee Miller, where we had a monkey in front of a setup. We show them, the monkey always has to move towards a target, but we don't show the monkey where exactly the target is. We instead show the monkey a little set of red lines that you see down over there. So in one situation, the left one, the low uncertainty situation, all those red bars are very close to one another. So the monkey will be almost always right if the monkey goes for the center of these red points. And then there's a situation where you have more uncertainty, where it's more spread out, and where it's very highly spread out. And there were a few other experimental manipulations that we did there. But the important upshot of why I'm talking about this experiment is just that none of the models did such a good job at explaining it. In fact, all of the models explained a little bit of the data, and none of them explained like the general pattern that we saw across the data. For example, some theories had predicted that there should be fewer spikes if we are more uncertain. Instead, what we see is we have more spikes. So here you see the normalized activity in area PMD on the right-hand side, red in the case where we have high uncertainty, and you can see that the firing rate goes up quite a lot, whereas in the low uncertainty, the firing rate goes up much less. So in that case, we have that if we're more uncertain, we will get more spikes there. But the important thing was that at all the things that we looked at, uncertainty seemed to be having an effect of it. So uncertainty isn't any of these simple things. And that brings me to the slide where I get to what really I think we can learn from that. So people in the field have often phrased it as the contrast between two things. We could be pre-wired Bayesian. If you want, each spike changes the probability. In some sense, for those models, the whole brain is built around the idea of representing uncertainty. And the alternative, the other extreme alternative, is that we could have just neural networks, black box learning, we just do gradient descent. The brain knows absolutely nothing about uncertainty, but we basically just learn how to pretend like we're Bayesian. The important thing is these two extreme models, extreme as they are, predict exactly the same behaviors in the end. Because the general learner will learn that behaving like a Bayesian is the statistically optimal thing, and after enough training, it will emulate the pre-wired Bayesian system perfectly. But of course, there's lots of potential models that we have in between. For example, it could be that the way the system is set up makes it easy to represent the computations that we need to deal with uncertainty. Or it could be that there's a pre-wired Bayesian system that gets a little bit of help of a general purpose supervised learning, and we could be anywhere on that spectrum. And I think that is a big question in computational neuroscience that people have never really thought much about, and that I think would be a great, interesting avenue for research now, because with the development of deep learning and all the research into neural networks, we are getting at more and more complicated systems in that areas that start having very interesting properties and therefore produce interesting models. So what's missing in current neural networks? Arguably, what's missing are representations that are good for representing uncertainty, ways of representing non-trivial structures, and I should mention there Josh Tenbaum's work, who can't be here today, and ways of controlling actions. I should just mention two papers in that framework. There's some great work on neural Turing machines that arguably gives a lot of potential structure information to neural networks and yet is fully differentiable, so all the standard approaches that people use in neural networks apply to it just as well. And I should also mention some ongoing work from the lab here, where we use deep networks to learn motor control. And for us, motor controls, the systems basically try and estimate the whole trajectory along with the control policy relative to the trajectory at the same time. And but lastly, I should mention, I still believe that we need a lot more data. So once we allow for more complicated models, it allows us to make much better use of data, because now that we have more complicated, if we have more complicated models, we need much more data to constrain them. And in that sense, more data and more complicated models go along with one another very well. So I want to mention two projects that I find interesting there. One of them is work where we're trying to use molecular biology to build a way of recording time-varying activities. And if that would work, then we could really record from arbitrary numbers of neurons at the same time. The idea is DNA polymerase normally copies DNA, so you can think about it as a dubbing tape recorder. We are trying to hack DNA polymerase so that instead of being a dubbing tape recorder, it's really a tape recorder, so that it writes time-varying neural activities on DNA. Then we could extract the DNA, sequence the DNA, then that would give us time-varying activities. If that will work, we will have a big data problem. I should mention a completely different set of data that I find important, and that actually shares a lot of the ideas that Matt was talking about. So here you see some work I did back with Daniel Wolpert in London, which is to quantify natural movements. So the whole purpose of the brain is to allow us to move, to allow us to be successful in the world. So far, we know almost nothing about the statistical structure of natural movements. And we really need to understand that structure. And if we are to understand how the brain does it, we really need to understand what the brain does. And in a lot of experiments that I've been working on, both on the movement side and on the visual side, if you go from trivial, low-dimensional stimuli to high-dimensional stimuli, natural stimuli, more natural movements, problems become much, much, much more complicated. And I think this is an area where we need a lot of input also from computational people. Also, talking about more data, I do believe that we need more anatomical data to better understand how the structure of the brain actually supports the computations. Which brings me to my conclusions. I do think that the representation of uncertainty isn't as simple as people like it to be, and I don't think it should be simple if it's not pre-wired. So as soon as we have a mixture between those two ideas of pre-wired and just learning, it will be very hard for us to interpret. And we need models that are lying somewhere in that general space. And we need a lot of data to constrain those models. And with that, thank you.
Great. So I guess I'm standing between you and lunch. It's not a very unenviable situation. So I'd like to thank Stefan and Josh and the organizers for inviting me. It's a great pleasure. As I mentioned, I'm extremely excited to be here. It's one of the few occasions where, as a computer scientist, I find people that are now interested in neuroscience. I've been trying to do this for the last about 14 years, and it's really great to see this interaction and synergy emerging. So what I thought I'll do today is I'll give you my perspective of how I feel, some of the interactions between neuroscientists and computer scientists can be really productive. And so here's a really high-level idea in terms of really generic interaction, right? So given some unexplained or puzzling data, biological data in this case, we'd like to come up with a normative theory. So normative means there's certain higher level top-down goals that your organism is trying to meet. And that in turn should generate predictions that could be potentially confirmed by experiments. So what is the canonical example that we could all cite for this? It's this, right? So this is the X-ray crystallograph for DNA, right? This was when Rosalind Franklin and Maurice Wilkins came up with the data for this. And of course, we all know the whole story, right? So the normative theory here was, the inspiration here came from the data and also results from Chargaff showing the Chargaff's rules about the ratios between the base pairs, right? So C and T pairing and AT and C and G pairing. So this led to this normative theory about replication, right? So can we come up with a model that could facilitate replication with DNA, right? So we all know about Watson and Crick's adventure in this particular realm of coming up with different models and finally finding something that fits, right? So this is an interesting example of a model that was inspired by the data that was not yet explained, but at the same time there was this idea of a higher level goal, right? Which is, can we come up with a model whose structure can lead to an explanation for how cells replicate, right? How does DNA replicate? And of course, this led to experiments that eventually we are able to figure out now a lot of the underlying machinery, right? That can confirm this, yes, indeed, this particular model has some validity, right? It's actually leading to results that the predictions that were generated are being validated by experiments. So I see that as sort of a dream, right? In neuroscience, where we have these normative models that are leading to experiments that are then giving us further new data that could potentially not be explained by the model you originally had, and then iterate that process. So I'd just like to give you some examples of, in my own experience, how one might go about doing this, using examples from my own trajectory over the last 14 years. So the main one that I'll spend some time on is this idea of a predictive coding model of the visual cortex. So this goes back to my graduate school days and in my postdoc days. So I was working with Dana Ballard and then Terry Sanowski. So this particular model was inspired by a puzzling phenomenon from neuroscience, which was something called end-stopping, which was reported by Hubel and Wiesel back in the 1960s and 70s. And the actual result is interesting. So a receptive field of a visual cortical neuron is this area of space where it responds the most. And so typically, the way the receptive fields are mapped is you shine a particular bar of light in this case, move it around in different locations, and then eventually figure out that, hey, there's some particular location where the cell responds a lot, and so let's call that the spatial receptive field of the cell. There's an orientation it likes best, so we'll call that the preferred orientation. And you get some spikes as shown at the bottom. But then something strange happens when you actually extend the bar beyond the so-called receptive field, right? So you see a suppression of the cell. So why is the cell no longer responding as much as it did when all you did was you just expanded this line, this visual stimulus, right? And so there could be explanations that are based on mechanisms at the neural level where you say, okay, there's horizontal connections and so on, but is there a normative explanation? Is there a functional explanation, right? And that's something that we as computer scientists really like to ask. And so when we asked this particular question, the inspiration for the explanation that we came up with came from other data from neuroscience. So we already know, so this is some data that was just coming out at that time, which was that just as we have this end-stopping phenomena, we also have something that you see, which is a contextual modulation, which is supposed to give this oriented texture to the visual cortex. You see some trajectory of activity. You can see the spikes at the top, many trials of the same stimulus, and you can see at the below that the histogram. But now if you change the central orientation to be orthogonal, which is opposite to what the surrounding orientation is, you see that there's now an increase in activity, so that the shaded area is the surplus in spikes, right? It's the increase in activity. And more interestingly, it seems like that increase in activity is happening after a little bit of delay, right? And so this inspired the notion that perhaps there's feedback coming in from higher cortical areas that are now causing this difference in activity. And so this could lead you to a potential explanation, which is that if the surrounding context predicts what's in the center, right, then your error signal, the difference in the prediction and what actually came in, is actually little, right? That there's little, the response is smaller than if the surrounding context is very different from what's in the center. And what's the underlying basis for making that assumption? Well, if you look at natural scene statistics, you do find that if there's a particular line in a very tiny location, that line tends to continue. Or if there's a texture at a particular orientation, it tends to also be the same texture in the surrounding regions. And that's an interesting statistical observation about natural scenes, which the visual system could potentially be learning or maybe inherited genetically, right? And so that was the underlying idea. And so how would you actually understand this phenomenon in terms of a computational model? So, okay, before we do that, I'll just give you a couple of other examples why we think this particular explanation was interesting. So in the retina, there's something like this going on already, right? So if you shine a spot of light covering the receptive field, and beyond that, in the retina, you see some activity. But then if you restrict it to a limited region, you have a much stronger activity. And this is the so-called center-surround organization of retinal receptive fields. So in this case, again, you could say it's an interesting observation in terms of the surrounding context, in this case, raw pixel values, predicting what's in the center. And it's a very simple linear model of prediction from the surrounding context, do a weighted average of your surrounding pixels, subtract that weighted average from the center, and what's left behind is what predicts the retinal response. And this is a model from 1982 by Srinivasan et al. And then that's a depiction of that model, right? There's a plus sign to indicate that that's the center activity, and then the minus is for a weighted average of the surrounding pixels. Similarly, if you look in time, in the lateral geniculate nucleus this time, which occurs between the retina and the visual cortex, you again see something like this happening, which is the response of the lateral geniculate nucleus cell, in this case the X cell, is again well modeled by a difference or a subtraction of the current pixel values in the past few milliseconds with what happened in the past. So you could interpret that as a prediction of what you're expecting to see. You're subtracting that prediction from what actually came in, right? So the plus is at the top, and then there's a minus sign at the bottom. So now it's a temporal predictive coding idea in this case, right? And in fact, in the lateral geniculate nucleus, you actually get both. You get spatiotemporal predictive coding if you look at the spatial receptive field also. So once again, you have the same idea of a prediction being made and then the prediction being subtracted away from what actually comes in, and what you're looking at is an error signal. So when we were looking at this in the context of the cortex, we thought of, in terms of computer science techniques, AI techniques, what's out there that is similar in terms of the phenomenon you're seeing. And of course, we all, computer scientists in the audience would recognize this idea of error correction, right? So you can think of it in terms of, if you pick your favorite Bayesian filter, right? So Kalman filter, particle filter, think of these kinds of algorithms that are making predictions, and then you have an internal model of the world that you're using to generate your predictions. And when something comes in, you're subtracting your prediction with what comes in, and then you're using the error to correct your estimate of what happened, and then you keep doing that as time goes on. And that's sort of the general idea of this predictive coding model that we suggested. And of course, you can come up with the individual components of the model, such as the feed forward, the feedback synapses. There's recurrent synapses that are calculating the temporal, the Markov matrix, if you think of it as a Markov system. And that leads to some predictions you can make about the data, and we indeed were able to compare it to some data that were out there at the time, and then there were some interesting predictions that were able to explain some data. And then finally, you could extend this to also a hierarchy. So if you think of the multiple layers of multiple areas in the visual system, there's some attempts to organize that as a hierarchical system. And so you can actually extend this module of a predictive estimator as multiple estimators across the visual field, which are then now feeding into higher areas. And in fact, this was well before the deep networks revolution, right? So, and in fact, it's a very interesting deep network because it's not a mere feed-forward deep network. This is actually a massively, feedback-based deep network. And at that time, of course, we didn't really have the amount of data you would need to train very, very deep networks, nor did we have the computational capacity to do it. But I think there's an interesting option here of actually extending some of the deep learning architectures to incorporate feedback and perhaps revisit this particular architecture. And finally, you can also start to make some really interesting predictions at the level of individual laminae in the cortex. So neuroscientists will tell us that there's roughly 6 layers in any cortical area. Maybe some cortical areas have collapsed a few of these areas. But there's also the sense that there's inputs coming in from so-called higher areas to the top layers, like layer 1 and layer 5. And then there's feedback going to a lower area from the deeper layers, like layer 6, for example. And that could be mapped, if you assume this particular model, it could be mapped now, so into the corresponding axonal projections out or into a particular cortical area. And so this kind of a hypothesis-driven, prediction, right? So you have this normative theory of that it's a functional model of brain function. Now you can make predictions, and you can ask, can we now test this particular theory, right? So what you need to test this theory is recording from multiple areas at the same time, large numbers of neurons. It's not been possible so far, but perhaps now with optogenetics you can start to do that. And then also at the same time seeing if you can get at the systems level picture, not just the single neuron picture, but systems level picture. There was one experiment, this was actually work done by Bruno Olsson with Scott Murray, where they had some intriguing results suggesting that if you show a human subject those 3 stimuli at the very top, so you show them some random lines versus show them a 2D or a 3-dimensional object, all formed by the same line. So the same lines, you've just displaced them in different ways, and you can create a 3-dimensional object, or you can create just a random bunch of lines. What you see when you observe their cortical activity is that, as shown at the very bottom, so the LOC is a higher visual area, and V1 is the primary visual area. What you see there is that for the random lines, what gets most excited are the lower level visual neurons, the V1 neurons. So you can see a big a jump in the activity there. Whereas when you start to assemble those pieces into a 3-dimensional object, now the lower area shuts down or it doesn't exhibit as much activity, the higher area takes over. So that's in some sense this idea that at different levels you have different abstract representations, and when the explanation is given by a higher level, the lower level prediction error becomes negligible. And so the prediction is actually taken out at the lower level, and what you see now is that the higher level you have a prediction being formed that's accurate to describe what just came in, which is in this case a 3-dimensional representation. I'll leave you with some other examples. So this is some work I did at the Salk Institute when I was working with Teresa Nowski. And there's this interesting phenomenon called spike timing dependent plasticity, where it's been shown that neurons in the hippocampus and in the cortex are very sensitive to when spikes arrive at their synapses. So that sensitivity goes down to about 40 milliseconds. So if you're within a 40 millisecond window, and if your incoming spike occurs about before 40 milliseconds have expired, before you actually have an output spike, that's when you see an increase in the synaptic strength, or LTP, right? Whereas if you now have a neuron spiking and then the input spike occurs after that, so in some sense the incoming spike missed the boat, right? It was not causing the spike to occur. Then you have a depression, you have a reduction in the connectivity. And it turns out there's an interesting way of explaining that from a reinforcement learning model called temporal difference learning. So we were able to make a connection between an idea from computer science there and then this very low level spike timing dependent plasticity. There's also some interesting connections you can make if you go down to the psychophysical level. So there's this interesting phenomenon called flash lag illusion, where if you have this the black, as you can see there's a black circle that's moving around, let's say in a circle, and you flash something right in the middle of it, and you're paying attention to this hollow circle moving around, and the flash occurs on your retina right in the center. But what you perceive is actually a lag there. So you see the flashed object, this flash circle, the yellow one, as appearing to lag the moving circle. And so we were able to come up with an explanation of that in terms of smoothing. So this is the phenomenon from, again, filtering theory, right, where you're able to get a better estimate of what's out there in the world if you wait a little longer to collect more information and then use that to update your estimate, as opposed to just updating it using the information in the current time instant. And finally, more recently, we've started to look at broader models. So this is the model for decision making with Mike Shadlin. And in monkeys, there's a lot of data coming now from labs such as Mike Shadlin's lab, showing that there are really interesting observations you can make at the level of single neurons of what happens when a monkey makes a decision in response to some visual stimuli. So we were able to model that using this concept of a partially observable Markov decision process, which is a really powerful framework from AI and from computer science, but at the same time also, as many of you know, it's a p-space complete problem, right? They're actually finding the optimal policy. So how is the brain really cracking that problem of coming up with an approximate solution to a very hard problem of making sense of uncertainty and making a decision based on its estimates, at the same time not getting trapped in this computational intractable problem. All right, so I'll leave you with some major themes. So From computer science, I look at it in terms of models, algorithms, and devices. And then brain science, you can think of it as you have actual neural solutions to some of these hard problems we'd all like to solve. And so going back to Mars, 3 different levels, I think that's a really useful way to look at what we're doing right now as a field. So the computational level, we've already heard Konrad stress the importance of handling uncertainty. Efficient coding is the other important concept. And then also, how do you incorporate rewards and costs? So the brain does have a reward system, and so it's incorporating that in its decision-making process. And finally, this overarching concept of optimization seems to be really useful when we tackle this idea of a normative theory. And then the algorithmic level, you could have things like Bayesian inference. Josh is not here today, but he would probably pound the table for hierarchical Bayesian inference, which is a really powerful way of modeling the world. And then put down their computational devices. So computer scientists and engineers can contribute computational devices that can be used to reverse engineer the brain. So this is the whole field of brain-machine interface or brain-computer interfaces, where you have algorithms and actual devices that can be implanted in the brain, and you can stimulate and observe what happens and record at the same time, right? So and then when you do that, it's a way of doing system identification of the brain. And then what do we get out of that? We get an insight into the implementation of some of these algorithms. So things like, how do you actually perceive, act, and how do rewards get incorporated, and so on. And finally, what do we get as a benefit to computer science? Well, we have feedback, back to the algorithmic level. You might have new algorithms for AI, machine learning, and robotics, and also you might get some novel computer interfaces, including this really crazy brain-to-brain interface that some crazy people did in a different location. And then finally, I have the last word because I'm the last speaker here, right? So big neural data is coming, right? So we've all heard about tons and tons of data that's out there right now, and it's going to be even more as we move forward, right? Especially with the Brain Initiative and so on. And I'll actually admit that there are going to be big experiments, we're going to call these experiments big experiments, that are generating the data, right? So let's give them that. So what is really missing here, right? So what is the missing picture? You probably already guessed, right? So what we need are big, and by big, I mean daring theories, okay? So that's what I think needs to be done in the next few years. Thank you.
Francisco.
Yes, very nice. So let me make explicit something that has been alluded to in several of your talks, which is I find it problematic that we have such an emphasis on the statistics of the world when we already know the physics of the world. So where does the nervous system come from? Newton and Darwin are fully unforgiving, right? The physics of the world exists, and if you don't deal with the physics of the world, Darwin is going to take care of you, right? So in a sense that we're a little bit like Copernicus was before Kepler and Newton, in the sense that they had a lot of statistics of how the stars move, this and that, until you have a representation of the physics of the system. But we have the advantage of actually knowing the physics of the world. So what I would like to see is more emphasis on applying those very strong constraints that we already know. I mean, we already know the physics of the world, the physics of the refrigerator, the physics of orange juice. We know that. So why don't we apply those as strong constraints to the inferences that are being discussed? I'm not saying that, internal models were mentioned and et cetera, but I think we need to bring that into the fold, because otherwise we could spend a lot of time collecting more and more data when in reality the physics should come into the picture.
So there's lots of ways how the physics very clearly has to come into the picture. One of them is, of course, movements in the real world. As soon as I interact with the real world obeys most of the time very simple physics equations, like stuff falls down accelerated with 9.81 meters per second squared. So the question is kind of where does that enter? And that is where my continuum comes in again. So one extreme way of thinking about it would be that we are born 9.81 meters per second square physicists. Or alternatively, we could have a way of relatively easily learning it, or alternatively, and Jan LeCun, who just came in here, would probably take the extreme other point that it's like in a world where stuff falls, it's very easy to kind of learn that, and you don't even need to consider it in a special way. It just falls out of the data.
Yeah, I think, I mean, the other interesting issue here also is, if you admit that we do have internal models, I mean, the brain is learning, or, it has some concept of an internal model, then where is that coming from? And so we had an interesting discussion yesterday about, there's chicks that are born with the knowledge that light comes from above, right? So, so the question is, that's part of an internal model of the world, right, which works. And so the question is, do we, as organisms, I mean, are we, what amount of this internal model is actually, are we getting from our genes? Versus, how much is it actually learned by interactions with the world, and then eventually you could bridge that particular. I mean, you could actually tackle that particular issue in terms of doing experiments with newborn kittens and so on, which have been done in the past. But I think ultimately you have to admit that there's this necessity to actually have some internal representation, some internal model. And I think what you're saying is, from a robotics point of view, let's use our knowledge of physics. Let's build robots that can do great. And for whatever knowledge is not sufficient, let's use uncertainty as a way to handle the lack of knowledge we have. The difference between the real world and the physics-based model, right? So I think it's depending on what your goal is, you might go one way or the other.
I want to add. Sorry, I'll add one more thing, because I am kind of fixated on this statistics question. I think physics. If we think about physics deeply, we might come up with important parts of the answers we're after. For example, I keep coming back to the fact that when we act on the physical environment, the effects of our actions are usually fairly local, right? So that allows us to decompose problems in certain ways. And that's just a property of the physical environment. But there are a couple of things that I think of right off the bat that make it insufficient to think just about the physics of the environment. One is that optimal behavior is defined in terms of some objective function. So you can think of that as survival, but on for a particular organism, it's actually going to be defined with respect to the reward system. The agent is, roughly speaking, trying to maximize reward. So if the statistics arise not just from the physics of the environment or of the body, but from the agent's preferences. The other thing is that it's not just the outside environment that matters, right? So if I'm coming out of a supermarket and I need to remember where my car is, certainly aspects of how space works and how cars work are going to be relevant, but also the way that my hippocampus works is going to be relevant, right? The optimal way of querying my memory at that moment is going to depend on the way that my memory works. So while I agree that physics is a critical part of the picture, there are other aspects for which we have to look inside the brain itself.
I don't know if I can make a comment on Francisco. This is Sandro Musevaldi. Because I agree on some of his statement about the physics. But the point is that we don't really know the physics as well. So there is an example that my old mentor Neville Hogan was giving as a thing that we can do naturally. It's called snapping a towel. Take a towel and you find a way to make it snap. If you give this problem to an engineer based on the physics, it's almost unsolvable. So the problem is actually how our brain learns the physics of the world through instruments that are probably different from the symbol system that we use as students. Okay, we may have other type of symbol system to work on, but they're probably not this one. And I think one thing I would like to hear comment about, a lot of has been said about the optimal control models, okay? And what I found sort of deficient in this analysis of optimal control is the cost functions. I mean, cost functions, engineer use control cost, okay? Typically, you find a lot of work where, you optimize, and so you can solve it analytically. But what is really the cost functions that we have, and what is the impact that the cost function has on the understanding of the physics? And I'm stopping.
So that's a great opportunity to get back to uncertainty with it. So I believe that a lot of the cost functions that we actually use in our lives aren't really the right ones, but are the ones that we basically see others use, and we're kind of statistical about it. We just try and approximate what is right, and we're very uncertain about it. And that might explain why a lot of the high-level cognitive phenomena show these really weird deviations from optimality.
Yes, I'm Giulio Sandini. Just a general observation to the panel. What I heard is are presentations which, to me, are a little bit biased toward the role of the brain as an observer and not as an actor in the world, which somehow relates also to the issue of physics of the world, that you cannot really learn if you don't act in the world. So I wonder if this is just because your main interest is in those areas, or you think you can get away with try to address these issues without considering the role of the brain as an actor and consequently the body itself. I didn't hear too much about the body in the panel, even if it is in the title.
Yeah, so I think that's partially because, of the limited time, I decided to focus on one aspect. But I think I did mention this whole concept of a partially observable Markov decision process as a way to, select actions in the world. And so the idea there is, at least within the context of that framework, the agent, the agent or the animal builds a representation it has a belief over the hidden states, and you can think of that as roughly the perception part, the part that's maintaining some hidden state. That's the state estimation part. But then the concept there is to then use that belief as a way to figure out which action to select that will maximize expected reward, for example, or optimize your cost function. So I think I think even Konrad and Matt are going to talk about that, is this idea of action selection in the context of an optimality criterion needs to actually happen in the context of a broader broader component, which is maintaining some estimate of what's happening out there, because you don't have access to the hidden state or to the task relevant parameters. You do have this notion of a belief or a way of handling the uncertainty from the sensors, but ultimately all that is subserving this goal of selecting an action, and you're doing that at least in the context of what we've said in terms of optimizing some reward or cost function.
Yes. On the other hand, any optimization criterion has to take into consideration the fact that the body has to move somehow,
right,
or the brain has to control a moving body. Otherwise, it doesn't. It's a very big limitation.
Right. Yeah, I think
so. One problem in that question, in that area, is also how we could use similar architectures to deal with the control problem and also deal with the inference problems. And you can say the body, at some level, that's just an inference problem. So that's something that therefore I'm not all that much worried about, because you can say, I want to estimate what the properties of my body are. And in fact, a good number of our models are of that nature. But on top of that, we need to do control. We need to find out of all the actions that we could do, which are going to be the successful ones. And quite possibly we'll need to use similar architectures. We know that a lot happens in cortex, and it does look somewhat similar between motor and visual areas. And then the question is, can we come up with architectures that support all those computations in the same way? And I think there's some very interesting new development by Toussaint and who else? And Todorov and Bert Kappen about seeing both inference and optimal control as really being two sides of the same control, and you can show a certain amount of duality between them.
Yeah, so I think a broader way of framing that question is that the representations we develop need to be used for things. And so in the case of reinforcement learning, then it might be used for actions. In the case of learning sound representations, it might then be used to represent words or syntactic structures or meanings. And I think that there's, at least on the language side, there's been a lot of interesting research on how those top-down influences really do exert an influence on learning, at least. And so I think that is definitely, at least in that domain, something that would be relevant to consider.
So let me insert a little bit questions here. So this is a brain computing panel, and the idea is, in some sense, so what should the brain people and the computing people do together in the future? And I think this panel here has a component that it inserted models and theories between the brain here, computing there, and we need something to constrain all that computing in the brain, and that may actually only work by having modeling insights or theories. And people may agree or disagree with that, and maybe you can still compute everything just based out of raw data. I don't know. I don't believe it, actually. But then, is there a possibility at sometimes? So building models is really hard. And people spend their entire life about, I build a stochastic optimal control model, or I build a complete perception action learning model where the entire loop is considered, or I just don't care about categorization, I don't care about segmentation. There's all these different views. one thing which would be very cool if we could create models automatically. Well, you want wild ideas, so here you go. How would you do that? This modeling is really annoying. Particularly, many models are beyond actually what I really know about physics or whatever is happening. Is there a way that we could do things like that?
Stefan, why would you want to do that? So I was recently talking to a colleague who is very proud because he had constructed a very complicated hierarchical inference scheme through which, by putting in data of planets, he could almost get Newton's law, but not quite. So if you can, and I think it goes back to the early comment about what you know about the physics of the world. If you know it, you should put it in, at least as a constraint, because it's true, as Sandro indicated, our knowledge of the physics is very accurate, but incomplete. Like, it's very hard to describe friction. It's very hard to describe complex dynamical systems. We cannot go from quarks to a cow, as everybody knows. But we know some basic laws that we already know. So I think that the idea of putting them as constraints it's a fundamental idea. It's something that we don't do as much as we should. And to try to infer everything from data as if we were all tabula rasa, I think it's a flawed idea. And it goes back to my deep suspicion as to where blank statistical analysis of big data is going to give us a clue as to how the brain works. Because blank, in the sense of task independent, powerful statistical analysis of big data based on the fact that we have big data, we have big computers, we can do big statistical inference. So I can, get the Google database to tell me what's a cat. But does that illuminate how the brain works? Doesn't the brain develop much more task-specific strategies that are based on a lot of previously accumulated knowledge, internal models of the world, gained either through evolution or through personal development? And so somehow I'm very suspicious of all these tabula rasa ideas in which you just I'm a big man, I have big data, I have a big computer, I have a big statistical inference algorithm, and I will solve the problems of the brain, the world, the origin of life, the structure of the universe. I'm very, very suspicious of that, skeptical, I should say, of that approach.
So of course, we know that it's impossible to only have data. So we know from the no-free lunch theorem that you can't learn anything if you don't make assumptions about the domain. Now, the question is, how useful are they? And you can say many assumptions that are behind machine learning techniques is that you assume some smoothness in an appropriately defined space. And you can say, if you add physics to it, it's another set of regularization approaches that you're effectively applying, and you can put more and more in the questions how much, and the good thing is that it seems like it's an answerable question. So if we take a system, we give it lots of data from the real world, how much worse does it do than a system that we give lots of data of the world and also physics? And I think that would be beautiful to ask these questions quantitatively.
Right. I think, it's not a all or none situation. So in the Bayesian approach, you can actually incorporate these physics-based models as a prior over, your in a hierarchical Bayesian model. You could start incorporating these constraints, and that in turn lets you handle uncertainty while at the same time also, incorporating whatever knowledge you have. The challenge there is, how much do you have to incorporate to be satisfied that that's a reasonable model of whatever you're trying to explain, right? So you can actually incorporate lots and lots of information, and then it'll perfectly explain your data, but then maybe you haven't learned much about the brain, right? So I think there's an interesting trade-off there into how much you're willing to incorporate, which you could potentially say was evolutionarily obtained, and then let loose that particular framework to the data that's coming in and do learning and so on.
So I personally am of two minds on this. On the one hand, I share your skepticism because and this is one of the issues for my own research that I tried to raise at the end of my presentation, I don't know how to I remember when I was an undergraduate, I was in a chemistry class, and the first thing the professor did is he said, "Okay, I want everybody to sit back and observe." And he sat there for a while, and his point was, there's no such thing. You know, you have to be like asking questions. You have to have hypotheses that you're testing. And so I'm not sure how you just go into a rich data set and find structure without going in and with some hypothesis about what kind of structure you're going to find. And yet, I want to do that in ecologically valid stimuli. So, you know, I'm tired of building toy worlds. I want to look at the real world, and it's very difficult to know how to weight. I think the answer is probably just, it's the way science always works, which is that, you know, you're working on something and something is in your peripheral vision. You're like, what is that thing? And you finally focus on it, and it gives you a new idea. But having said all of that, I have to say that I was initially very skeptical of work on lexical representation that's based purely on distributional data. So when latent semantic analysis came out, my feeling was, wow, you know, that's a neat trick, but come on. I mean, there's meaning, you know, you can't just go on the distributions of words. And I have to admit that over the intervening years with new developments and new ways of validating these distributional representations of words, I'm pretty impressed at how much information there is and how cognitively valid it is, and how you can just throw it right at fMRI data, and it turns out that it captures variance in that data. So that's why I'm of two minds.
So I'd like to pick up a little bit on something Stefan just said, which is, okay, we've got all this data, and there are these models that, you know, it seems like we need to build in to interpret the data in the context of understanding the brain. But what strikes me is the dichotomy between this panel and the previous panel. So the previous panel told us about all this data we can get about how the brain works. And the conversation here is starting to drift off into how do we incorporate, you know, environmental constraints and everything else. I would think the answer should be, well, we're getting all of these constraints from data about the brain. How do we build what we're going to be able to learn about the anatomy and the functional operation of the brain into these higher level models? I'm wondering if anybody can maybe cast the ball a little down the field and opine, you know, where might we go if we could somehow bring these two worlds a little closer together?
Yeah, so I think that the research into how brain populations of neurons or all of that stuff encodes the kinds of representations that we talk about at a cognitive level is super interesting. And personally, I think that we're not going to be able to just sort of make an inference about cognitive representations based on brain data until we get a little bit farther with that work. And that would be, I guess, the path that I might see to being able to do that. And if we can understand the strategies that the brain is using in order to encode information that we can talk about at the level of the environment, or information that we can talk about at the level of the task, then I think that might get us to the point where we can learn directly from brain data. But at this point, if the goal of understanding the brain is to understand how we think, then I think that link is still weak, and we need to do more work on it.
I mean, this gap is huge. It's important to realize that. So we don't know how to get from maps to dynamics, and we have no idea how to get from dynamics to something that works like a brain for high-level cognitive decision-making. It's a huge gap. It's not that many of the insights will become central for research in cognitive science very soon.
Yeah, I think part of the issue is that there's even certain really fundamental issues that are still not completely resolved, such as, you know, what is the fundamental sort of information coding or information representation in neurons, and what's the role of timing of spikes versus, you know, the good old firing rate representation that a lot of people are still very much wedded to. And so there's this whole question of information representation that is still not completely clear. And so I think to build on top of that, I mean, that's what is I think keeping us from really testing some of these models, is that disconnect between the normative theories and models that have really interesting implications, but then to push it down to the level of neural implementation, right? I mean, that's where I think a lot of the gap is going from theories and you know, inspired by computing and AI to go down to the level of implementation.
So going back to the question that Sarah raised of, you know, no tabula rasa, why don't we build the physics? I'm here. Hi, Sarah. So I don't think anyone would reasonably argue for complete tabula rasa. As you said, there was no free lunch theorems and stuff like that, and you always have to build a little bit of structure, of course. But there is a whole world between the blank slate and the building every laws of physics into a system. So I haven't worked a lot on motor control, but I've worked a lot on perception, and with the history of computer models for perception, and you were part of this, Sarah, is that the more prior knowledge we remove, the better it works, and it's just a fact. It's we look at the history of speech recognition, handwriting recognition 20 years ago, image recognition right now, and NLP actually right now as well. And the more prior knowledge we remove, the more you use data and now deep learning, the better it works. So the problem, I think, is that when we build prior knowledge into a system, we can always do it wrong. And sometimes there are assumptions we're making that turn out to be wrong, and they limit the performance of the systems that we have. This is very clear for perception. So there were lots of approaches to computer vision back in the 80s where people attempted to kind of model the process of image formation to do computer vision, analysis by synthesis. It was a complete failure, complete and utter failure. And so it's completely abandoned now. And so the point of this is, there is something to be said for relying on data and learning.
Okay, I need to say something for just right. So, okay. So physics is overrated. That's okay. From a motor control point of view, this is really hard to deal with. On the other hand, you're absolutely right. Models are always wrong, which is something which is incredibly annoying if you deal with big motor systems like a walking system whatsoever. And just one example along these lines, so like a year ago we had a meeting of a whole bunch of people who work on big humanoid robots for the DARPA Robotics Challenge. And everybody does these days QP optimization through analytical models and all kinds of other optimization techniques. And I asked him in the end, so what would you like the learning guys do for you? We have no idea. But still, the human system does learn these things, and I don't think we have QP optimizers in the brain in that form. So it is an empirical-driven system. And so, in some sense, I love what you say, that we should be able to discover that from data. And I also love when people say, hey, you need model biases, and you should put in any knowledge you have, and then you say again, it's wrong. So how do we do science out of this? So what is the right way how to go? In some sense, the brain solves it empirically with some biases, which I don't know how they're coded. And our modeling is incredibly impoverished, but it's been the tool we've been using for such a long time, so successfully, to make sense of things. Maybe we shouldn't try to make sense of things. Maybe that's the way to go, which is quite sensible. No, that makes no sense.
It's actually a relatively low-dimensional problem, but it's a nonlinear problem. So it's a complicated problem. So people dealing with the control of a robot manipulator in 6 dimensions, you have a relatively already complex problem, and most of the problem of behaviors are already the complexity of being in general nonlinear. And it seems to me that what we see in behavior is probably, when you think about the way to understand behavior, is a way is performing a dimensionality reduction on the brain. It's sort of a natural way to see it, but I think behavior has to be looked at a more complex scale than what is normally done. And so I think that there is this struggle between somewhat reducing dimensionality on one hand. If you do, for instance, brain-machine interface, and you have to think about decoding signals, right? And on the other hand, you have this other trend to look at every single synapses, which is actually going exactly in the other directions. And so, to me, one thing that is to understand is what is the tension between these two things. And when we were talking about putting constraint from physics, for example, it's true on one hand, but when you do physics the way we do it, we assume certain type of representations. We use, for instance, we write the dynamics equation by using forces. And forces are something which is not clear if it is an invention of Newton, or if you can actually describe physical system with or without them. What is the brain doing? What kind of, it's probably using different form of representation, and that's why you have to see at what level you put the constraints from the physics. I mean, it can be, is it the constraint that comes from, your book on analytical mechanics, or is it something else? So the way that introducing the constraints, which is effectively doing a dimensionality reduction in a way, implicitly, right? It's a critical and difficult operation. I mean, you don't, does it help to understand what the brain does? And to me, that is not a question that has really settled.
Just, we had a question in front first, and if someone could pass the other microphone to Satinder, is that still existing?
Yeah.
There it is. It's about the people listening; they can't hear it otherwise.
I was going to comment on the previous comment that the more of the data we use and the less of the modeling constraints, the better the system performs. We have to be very cautious not taking this to the extreme, because by the same argument, one should remove all regularization terms we have and let the data fit. So what I think what we need to be doing, which is the standard scientific approach, is when we're sure that the model is validated, number one, and number two, appropriate for the question, then we should be using it. But both of these are big issues. Number one, of course, the validation. Number two, the appropriateness. We might have a good model of how the normal brain works, but if the question is, how does the autistic brain work? And you try and you have data that on which you try to impose the wrong model, and you have forgotten that that model was only validated and appropriate for certain types of data, then that's a big problem. So I think, both validated and cautiously used models are useful.
Yes, so I'm on the same vein, so I can try to keep it short. So all the examples that people pointed out, Jan LeCun pointed out just now about vision, about NLP, about images and so on, have big data. So the question for those of us who are interested in actions or behavior, one interesting question to ask would be, how do we get to the same stage where we have big data for that sort of problem, so that we can hopefully play the same game that is being played on these more straight perception sides of the problem? Because then maybe we will not have to build in as much and hopefully discover the simplest minimal principles that lead us to this great flexibility that we're getting on the perception side. So thoughts about how to get us, the reinforcement learning people or the action people, to the same stage?
So I think, are you referring to getting big data where you have people or animals performing actions in a natural environment while simultaneously recording from the brain? Or is it just action data, behavior by itself? Because those are, one is harder than the other, right? So I think, Matt already talked about...
The point I'm trying to make, though, is that yeah. if we wanted to get to the place where, with minimal sort of learning principles, we could automatically discover the answers of what predictions are useful to make, what policies are useful to learn. How, if we want to get to the same sort of answer these questions from a bottom-up sort of way, we would need very large data sets in order to do that.
Right.
And the question is, are people thinking in the community who collects data to try to give us such data sets on the action side?
I think producing such data would be awesome. The only problem is that the right kind of data might be in terms of muscle activations, and getting those data is impossible at the moment. But already getting a big data set of natural human movements during everyday life would be incredibly exciting. And if anyone here is doing something like that, see me later.
I was reminded that there might be food at some point, and we should wrap up. But I would like to mention that might, what just was discussed in the end, might be a potential topic for a breakout, and creating big data for cognitive sciences, it's not that easily available like on Google Images. It's often very specific to the individual, to the system you look at, and then you create data for 100 years and still don't have enough to fill a 100-dimensional space. So that might be very interesting. So I think I'm supposed to pass it on to Greg now, who wants to say something. Thank you very much to the panel and to the audience. It was very interesting here.